My name's Gregory Dark. What follows is an edited version of an article I wrote, We Have to Be Serious, inspired by the Wimbledon Tennis Championships. If you would care to read the whole article, or if you'd prefer to read it rather than hear it, please go to my website, www.gregorydark.net, all one word, all lowercase. We have to be serious. It's Wimbledon again. The plunk of balls, the plink of ice in the Pims, the smell of freshly mown grass and titanium, strawberries and cream, sing-alongs, with Sir Cliff Richard. And John McEnroe. Why do I dislike Mr. McEnroe so much? We have acquaintances in common who have told me, and in no uncertain terms, that in private he is courteous to a fault, a footfault presumably, of beguiling even a seductive man. I don't disbelieve those acquaintances, but I can't get it to matter. I don't know him privately. The only face I do know is the public one. That, I'm afraid, is one of the prices exacted by celebrity. Often those endowed with it cease to be a person and start to become a persona. I accept that the private Mr. McEnroe is delightful. His public persona is, though, not delightful, and it is one which I dislike, yes, all right, even disproportionately, for and of itself, but much more for the embodiment that it is of so very much of what is wrong with the world. As I say in my forthcoming book, Man of the New Millennium, essentially the ethics, if such they can be called, of Mr. McEnroe the persona are exactly the same as those of Enron. Our need for real ethics today is desperate. Their lack is life-threatening, indeed species-threatening. So important are they that the first book of the Millennium Trilogy, The Prophet of the New Millennium, is even subtitled A Search for Principles in an Unprincipled Age. It is acknowledged by all but a few complete loonies that mankind is involved in the biggest crisis of its existence. We will not escape from this situation by spinning our way out of it or soundbiting our way out of it. We have to define a new code of real ethics, ones relevant to today, and then abide by them. It is thus we will survive. Propagating a lack of ethics, as do the likes of Enron and Mr. McEnroe, is akin to the man crossing the Sahara puncturing his water bottle. The public persona of Mr. McEnroe embodies the concept that all that matters in this world is winning, and winning in a very narrow context indeed. The notion that it is somehow beneficial or endemic to us to win at any cost is costing us very dear indeed. It could cost us our species. Now, before I start getting too holier-than-thou for words, let me start with a confession. Not a full-fledged one, I'm afraid, not the kiss-and-tell one, just a mini-confession, a confessionette. It is, after all, axiomatic that when we dislike others most is when they echo or mirror aspects of ourselves with which we are not too comfortable. One of the reasons that I so dislike competition is that I'm such a terrible loser. I would be quite capable of cheating playing snap with a 4-year-old. My antics in that regard would make those historically of Mr. McEnroe appear by comparison rather to belong to Mr. Darcy. I concede that often my conduct is execrable. That of Mr. McEnroe rarely rose above the distasteful. There is, however, one fundamental difference between my conduct and his. My tantrums are witnessed by maybe 4 people, those of Mr. McEnroe by 40 million. I am, thank God, a role model to no one. He was, again, to millions. There is also this fundamental difference. I am chastised for my conduct. He was lionized for his. And it is there where we start entering into the realms where his conduct has global implications, where it stops becoming just bad manners and starts becoming moral pollution. Actually, in my heart of hearts, I don't blame Mr. McEnroe at all. If ever I were in a position that someone said to me, here's truckloads of cash, Greg, just behave badly and it's all yours, well then you'd better believe quite how quickly and quite how badly I'd behave. And if people criticised me for that, just like Liberace, I'd cry all the way to the bank. I do blame industry, however, and I do blame the ethos not to be confused with ethics which industry has nurtured via Mr. McEnroe amongst others. Industry perceived that it was in its interest that Mr. McEnroe behaved badly, and it paid him substantial sums in order that he did so. And yes, Sir Mr. McEnroe, I am being serious. And yes, this is something we do have to take seriously, because it impacts on all of us. And it impacts on us all seriously. How much delinquency has been spawned by the nurturing of this ethos? I'm completely unconvinced about the concept of zero tolerance as a method of combating either antisocial behavior or actual crime. is just another trite phrase which actually means nothing and which signifies only that government internationally is less interested in tackling problems than it is in the public believing it is tackling problems. But if we are to have zero tolerance, then that is what we must have. Every psychiatrist and psychologist since Freud has emphasized the need children have for consistent messages, the incredible dangers contained by mixed messages. We cannot have zero tolerance except for. It don't work that way. Particularly not when those except fors are people whom the impressionable may want to emulate. Government puts health warnings on cigarettes, bans narcotics because such are unhealthy activities, and yet condones, even applauds, this incredible damage to emotional health. I am reminded of a speech made by Mr. Blair when still Prime Minister to his party's faithful, which in his case meant sycophantic. He was striving, so he declaimed, to create a job society and not a yob society, and this, also entirely vacuous phrase, was greeted with rapture by his toadied audience, who had presumably forgotten that to one of his very first receptions as Prime Minister he had invited Oasis, freshly returned, if I recall aright, from their triumphant trashing of their latest 747. When yobs infamous locally behave badly, we hear the usual cries that these thugs deserve a short, sharp shock. When yobs famous nationally, even internationally, behave badly, they are feted at Downing Street or are invited to play tennis at Buckingham Palace. If we are serious about tackling the enormous problems with which we're confronted today, we have to develop a sense of proportion. And this too is so important that the second book of the New Millennium trilogy, The God of the New Millennium, is subtitled A Search for Balance in an Age of Spin. Marx famously and erroneously claimed that religion was the opiate of the masses. Well, today that opiate is sport, and like any opiate, it dulls the senses, it absorbs us so completely that it blinds us to what else is happening around us. Industry loves sport, partly for that reason. It sponsors it, i.e. advertises via it, to the tune certainly of billions per year, probably internationally trillions. Not because sport creates winners, but because increasingly it wants us to consider ourselves losers. Losers are much more compliant. Sport also provides industry with a paradigm acceptable to public opinion for a conduct in business which, without sport, would be unacceptable. Winning in business terms is profit. If in sport it is at any cost that winning is acceptable, in business it is at any cost that profits are made. Banks are able to excuse what would otherwise be inexcusable behavior on the basis that such creates profits. Multinationals are allowed to flout local laws and all traditions because anything else would be to endanger profits. The exploiters of slave labor in what is patronizingly called the developing world condone their violations of human dignity on the basis that such creates profit. I sincerely hope, incidentally, that Nike has considerably improved its sense of morality since Naomi Klein so heroically exposed their disgraceful practices in No Logo. Otherwise, I wonder that so many sports stars, dedicated as they all are to concepts like fair play and sportsmanship, should so flagrantly allow themselves to be bedaubed with the insignia of slave laborers. Again, in The Prophet of the New Millennium, the eponymous character claims that greed is hatred. I entirely agree with him, and the evidence for that claim, I would suggest, is both ubiquitous and irrefutable. One of the most serious of the crimes committed by President Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher was that they made greed acceptable. One of very many committed by Messrs. Bush and Blair is that they made it desirable. The world, as Scott Peck once so wisely wrote, needs to be sold on love. Instead, it has been sold on hatred, and with that it has been sold a real bum steer, possibly a steer so bum it will kill us all. If in sport you have to win at whatever cost, that is not sportsmanship, it is hatred. It is in fact pure hatred, and it is that simple. And yes, Mr. McEnroe, I am entirely serious, and yes, my friends, we do need to be entirely serious. New balls.